On the line with us is J. David McSwane. He's the author of a new book, Pandemic, Inc., Chasing the Capitalists and Thieves Who Got Rich While We Got Sick. He's also an investigative reporter with ProPublica's D.C. office. We frequently feature their work here on this program. They just do such extraordinary, great work. DavidMcSwane.com is his website and his Twitter handle. David, welcome to the program. What got you started on this book?
Thanks for having me. Well, I got started reporting really in the early months of the pandemic as we realized the Trump administration was woefully ill-prepared and hospitals didn't have the supplies they needed. I was here in D.C. watching the outflows of just hundreds of millions of dollars and eventually billions to source these supplies. We had something like 1% of what we needed in the national strategic stockpile. So we just saw contracts flying all over the place to unknown companies and companies that we could tell had just been created, and pretty big deals, including, $34.5 million deal given to a person who'd never had a federal contract to supply to the Veterans Administration, which is the, which oversees the largest hospital network in the country. And from there, it sort of set off a year and a half of just really wacky reporting following how the federal government was being taken for a ride and taxpayers were being screwed.
It seems that if you, had $100 to start a new company, to file your incorporation papers with the state, and you had a friend like Peter Navarro or Jared Kushner, you could make millions of dollars basically on BS. I mean, on nothing, and not be held to account. Am I exaggerating?
No, those are sort of two separate issues. So one of the first contractors I noticed was a company called AirBoss of America, ultimately Canadian owned. And as I was just sort of combing through what is usually kind of boring contracts and purchasing data, noticed an entry in there that said, this deal, something like $90 million for, the sort of like hazmat respirators that you saw Dustin Hoffman wear in an outbreak, was ordered by the White House, which you just don't see. And that's when we got a sense that political appointees, somebody in the White House, was steering contracts, which you can't have for obvious reasons. And we got that story out, and as we dug in deeper, it seemed there were sort of two tracks. There was a connection to the Trump White House, which was fantastic, and you could get a deal, and Peter Navarro and others would push for that. But you could also just be a no-name company. You could file for an LLC on Monday and have a $10 million contract with FEMA by Wednesday or Thursday, because we were that desperate, and pretty much all vetting had been thrown out the window. At the time, the federal government denied that, but the evidence was just mounting.
My recollection is that Trump had put Jared Kushner in charge of a little group of people who were, apparently a lot of them were like friends of his from college, or something like that. I mean, these are, young people in their 20s and early 30s who were organizing this stuff on spreadsheets, and it was a cluster. I mean, it was a mess. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, it was total madness. I detail this in the book. They came to be known by the Navy admiral who was actually in charge of supply chain logistics as the Kushner Kids, because he shows up to work. He'd been pulled over from the Pentagon to FEMA. He shows up to work and he sees all these young people who don't really know where they're going, and realizes there's a bunch of civilians who've been inserted into the national pandemic response. And what had happened was there was the official task force, which was headed up by Vice President Mike Pence, which in and of itself, some people balked, because you're supposed to have an emergency management expert, not a politician, in charge of these things. But that was the official task force. And then Jared Kushner, on his own, using his network of well-to-do folks and his private cell phone, organized his own sort of shadow task force. And it really overshadowed the larger effort, clumsy as it was, but, legitimate and serious government workers trying to source things, because they were referring, contractors to the state of New York, for instance. In one case, ventilators. This guy said, I can deliver, hundreds of ventilators, and he got a major contract and he never had access to ventilators. So you just had people who didn't know what they were doing, kind of overshadowing the effort to catch up.
Did he keep the money?
In that instance, he was actually paid up front, which most of the time the federal government, at least, well, states and cities would, the federal government wouldn't pay up front, but he was paid up front, and they are currently suing to claw back some of that money. I haven't looked at the case file in a little while, but right. Yeah, they had to try to claw that back.
Jared Kushner's dad went to prison for being a professional grifter. Kushner just got what looks to a lot of people like a $2 billion payoff from the Saudi government for, covering up or helping cover up, or at least not reacting to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and for pipelining a bunch of military weaponry that Congress tried to stop from the United States into Saudi Arabia for their war on Yemen. Is there evidence that Kushner was corruptly, with corrupt intent, trying to game this system?
We may yet find out more details to that effect. In my reporting, I found that a lot of it was innuendo. I mean, you got to remember, a lot of the contractors who came out of the woodwork didn't even have things to provide. And, inserting Kushner, who, as you mentioned, is really kind of a, backdoor deal, working in the shadows kind of guy, just really added to the suspicion that something was up here. I mean, I will say that pre-pandemic, selling masks is not the best business model. It's pretty hard to do. There's not a lot of demand. That's part of why we were so reliant on China. So there were a few companies that were poised to really get big deals, such as the one I mentioned earlier, AirBoss of America, because they were in the industry and they had a legitimate product that they could sell. But we're really talking about just thousands of random companies coming out of the woodwork and suddenly being dubbed, major contractors.
How much did we lose, we, the federal government? How much did we lose to, fraud and theft and BS artists when the Trump administration had this stumble-bum response to this COVID pandemic?
I wish I could give you a figure. I detail several anecdotes in the book, but this was so widespread. You have that initial gush of money to try to source supplies, get ahead of it, protect healthcare workers. There was a lot lost in there. There was a lot of price gouging. That's really hard to quantify, to really establish the scope. And then you have the Paycheck Protection Program, about $800 billion in small business loans, many of them forgivable. And this, that program was just a bonanza for fraud, because people could just easily lie, stick a couple numbers on their paperwork and walk away with millions the next week. Law enforcement and prosecutors are going to be catching up to this for a long time. And that's part of why President Biden, in his recent State of the Union address, mentioned the creation of a special prosecutor for pandemic fraud. It is a profound mess that we're going to be grappling with for a long time. Yeah,
it seems like Democrats are always brought in to clean up the messes the Republicans leave behind. It's pretty breathtaking. We're talking with J. David McSwane. His book is Pandemic, Inc., Chasing the Capitalists and Thieves Who Got Rich While We Got Sick. David, last question, essentially. What do we learn from this?
I'm glad you asked that. The book, in writing this, I was, like everybody else, enduring a pandemic, and was very conscious that, we're all tired. We'd love to move on. So my goal isn't to depress this further, but I really think this book is a blueprint of exactly what not to do. There are a few obvious things, such as make sure you fund the National Strategic Stockpile, make sure the president invokes the Defense Production Act early, from the political side, doesn't deny an inconvenient pandemic. But the truth is, we're still in this. We're still learning lessons. The Biden administration really bet big on vaccines, which is great, but didn't pay enough attention to testing. So, we had Omicron coming in earlier this year and late last year. There's a lot we're still wrapping our heads around. Mm-hmm. But as far as, the grift and the waste, I feel like this book really shows a sort of damning portrayal of how the government, including states, were taken for a ride and taxpayers got screwed.
Amazing. J. David McSwane is the author. The book is Pandemic Inc., Chasing the Capitalists and Thieves Who Got Rich While We Got Sick.